Hi everyone! In this video, or series of videos, we're going to talk about another type of compound interest, which is meant to piggyback off of the previous lesson on compound interest on pages 15 and 16. This is going to be another type of compound interest called compound interest with E. E is going to be a number, eventually. And you'll start to see why, in practical terms, the letter E, a number, ends up being a very important and helpful tool to help us use compound interest in our practical daily lives. So, as you're looking at many of these questions, you'll see a lot of similarities to the lesson that we did on pages 15 and 16. And if you feel like you still have questions on that lesson, I would recommend that you address those questions before delving into this lesson, because many of those concepts, many of those ideas are going to keep building here, and I want to make sure that you have some time to really let those ideas sink in before you try to build anything else on top of them. Now, in question number 1, we're going to start with what I hope to be a relatively familiar compound interest situation. We've got $2,000 in a bank account with 8% annual interest compounded quarterly. We've seen enough of these problems to know now that compounded means divided quarterly, so we know that in general we can figure out an expression or an equation that we can plug into to represent an investment period of 20 years. Now it wants us to write the expression, not the answer. So where it says do not simplify or solve, that implies that we want to simply write all of the pieces to the formula, but not actually solve anything. So let's see what that would look like. 2,000 is my initial value, so we know it's going to be a geometric expression. 2,000 is my initial, times the percentage turned into a decimal. So 8% annual interest is going to get divided quarterly. 8% divided into 4 yearly quarters is going to be 2% per quarter. And now I need to convert that 2% to my multiplier. So that's 100% of the money plus 2% more money. That's 102% of the money. 102% is 1.02 to the power of, and this is where we need to be careful, 20 years, but it's measuring in quarters. So there are two ways you can think about this. You could first just think, well, there are 4 quarters in a year times 20 years, or you could write it with the exact same structure and 80 to represent 80 quarters in the 20-year span. Both ways of writing it are completely fine. The reason it said do not simplify or solve, though, is because of question number 2. In question number 2, they're going to give you a formula. You've not been expected to see this formula before. I don't anticipate this being a new thing. I don't anticipate this being an old thing. I should make sure I'm clear about that. I don't think many of us have seen this thing before, and it's not because you're supposed to. But what I do want you to do is to think about the fact that you've seen this concept before. If you're looking at this formula here, what familiar parts to this structure can you discern? Is there anything about the structure that you could say, I haven't necessarily seen this exact equation, but I've seen things out in front of parentheses. I've seen exponents. I've seen things in the parentheses. Because the question now is, can you draw some parallels between this formula and the answer that you wrote to number 1? If you can, see if you can use those parallels to answer question number 2 piece by piece. It wants you to try to express what you think each of these individual letters represents in this formula using question number 1 as an example. For instance, and I'll just give you a quick example, P looks like it's in the exact spot that the initial value is usually in. So I'm going to put 2,000 here for P, because it looks like that's a pretty precise match. 2,000 is in the spot where the letter P in the formula is, so even though I don't know why it's called P or what that stands for, I still can use common sense to say, hey, it looks like 2,000 is that number. So see if you can try letters R, N, and T, and see if you can kind of figure out what those might be. If you can go one step further, see if you can decode what those actually represent. For example, P was the initial value, so you could write something like that just underneath it to show that you understand what the significance of 2000 is. That's the initial value, and that is significant, so I'll write that. See if you can try that in question number 2. And if you're not sure about some pieces, or maybe all of the pieces, you can either look at the answer key, or in the next video, I'll talk about each piece so that you can understand it better.